A black health inspector walks into a barbecue restaurant in small-town Georgia. He shows his badge. He speaks politely. But before he can finish his sentence, the owner, a white woman in a red hat, cuts him off. "You people don't belong here." What happens next? It starts with a refusal and ends with handcuffs, headlines, and a town forced to confront the truth it's been hiding under smoke and sauce for far too long. The sun in Hartswell, Georgia doesn't shine. It presses. By late afternoon, the heat has settled into the sidewalk like a secret, thick and still, humming low over the cracked pavement. Cicadas scream from somewhere in the trees, but even they sound tired. At the edge of town stands a brick building, the color of rust, with a sign that reads, Hensley's BBQ, in flaking white paint. Smoke curls from a steel chimney out back, rising into the lazy sky like it's trying to escape. The air smells of mesquite wood, fat sizzling on fire, and something harder to name, something bitter, old, and woven into the bones of the place. The front porch creaks as a screen door slaps shut. A bell jingles inside. Country music spills from dusty speakers. And somewhere behind the counter, Margaret Hensley watches everything. She stands like she owns not just the building, but the air inside it. Her hair is set tight, unmoving despite the slow blading ceiling fan overhead. Her lipstick is the same shade it's always been, confrontation red, and her eyes, cold, calculating, sweep the room like floodlights in a prison yard. She doesn't need to say much. The walls say enough for her. A faded American flag hangs above the cash register next to a laminated sign, "We speak English here." Another reads, "Respect our traditions or leave." There's a shadow of a Confederate emblem etched onto a plaque behind the sweet tea urn. And in the back corner, under a photo of Margaret shaking hands with a long-forgotten congressman, someone scrawled a phrase in permanent marker. Southern pride never died. The customers, mostly regulars, nod when they speak to her. They know the rules. They know not to ask about the signs, not to question the glances she gives when someone walks in with the wrong accent or the wrong skin. Margaret's voice is syrupy when she wants it to be. But her judgment cuts sharp, quiet but unmistakable, like the clang of a freshly sharpened knife on butcher's steel. She wipes down the counter slowly, methodically, even though it's already clean. From her vantage point, she sees the parking lot through the front window. And just then, something changes in her face. Subtle. A flicker. Barely there. Because a car has pulled up, not from around here. A government vehicle, state plates. And from the driver's seat steps a man in uniform. Neat shirt tucked, clipboard in hand. His skin is dark. His walk steady. Margaret narrows her eyes. Outside, the sun keeps pressing. The smoke keeps rising, and Jamal Carter takes his first step toward the door. The bell above the door let out a weary chime, as if even it knew this wasn't going to go well. Jamal stepped inside. The air was thick, not just from the smoke that hung low like a memory, but from something less visible, more hostile, the kind of tension that doesn't shout. It just exists, like mold in old walls. He adjusted the collar of his inspection uniform. His badge glinted faintly in the amber light, clipboard in one hand, a pen clip neatly to the top. Every step he took was measured. Not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the storm he knew was already brewing. He had walked into many kitchens before, greasy spoons, strip mall diners, food trucks rattling with soul and spice. He had been ignored, welcomed, even thanked. But here, the silence met him like a slap. At the far end of the room, Margaret turned. She didn't speak right away, she just looked. The kind of look that slices without moving a muscle. The kind of look that says, "I've seen what you are, and I've already decided." Jamal offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, I'm here for a routine health inspection scheduled by the state of Georgia." Margaret didn't nod back, her lips tightened. "And they sent you?" He let the words land, let them echo. Then calmly he raised his badge. "My credentials are in order. This won't take long. I just need access to the kitchen and food storage areas." She leaned her elbows on the counter, slow and deliberate, as if she were sizing up something she intended to butcher. "I don't care what badge you flash. I don't want you poking around my business. Not someone like you." A few heads turned from the tables, not in protest but in idle interest, like a bar crowd waiting to see if a fight would start. Jamal didn't flinch. "This inspection is mandatory, ma'am. Failure to comply." "Oh, save it." Her voice grew louder, not in pitch, but in weight. "You people are always waiving rules like you made them. Well, this is my place, my rules, and I don't answer to you." Behind her, the grease from the fryer hissed like a warning. Somewhere, a fly buzzed near the condiment station, unseen but constant, like the way this town buzzed with a hate it had taught itself to hide behind politeness. Jamal clicked his pen, not in frustration, in ritual. He began to write. Margaret scoffed. "What are you going to do? Mark me down? Run and tattle to your little department?" He said nothing, just wrote, "Refused entry, subject hostile, inspection denied." The pen scratched against the paper like it was etching truth into stone. His hands didn't shake, his voice didn't rise. But inside, something sank. Not with surprise, he had learned long ago that racism never arrives with novelty, but with the weight of repetition. This isn't new, he thought, but it's still never easy. As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him, "Don't come back unless you bring someone who actually belongs here." He didn't answer, didn't turn, just walked back into the Georgia heat, clipboard in hand, dignity intact, and a silence behind him louder than any insult she could have hurled. The sky over Hartswell had turned the color of bruised fruit, heavy purple-gray, with the promise of rain that never quite arrived. At exactly 2:07 p.m., a Silver State vehicle pulled into the lot of Hensley's BBQ. This time, Jamal Carter didn't come alone. Two other inspectors stepped out behind him, each dressed in the same crisp uniform, each carrying a copy of the court order, embossed with the seal of the state of Georgia. Jamal's clipboard was still with him, but this time his hand rested differently on it. Not tighter, not tenser, just firmer. Like someone who knew he wasn't knocking anymore. He was walking through the door. Inside the restaurant, the bell chimed again, sharper now, like it remembered. Margaret turned from the counter, her lips curled before the words came. "Well, well, look who brought his little parade." Jamal didn't respond. One of the inspectors stepped forward, handed her the document. "We have a court-issued mandate to perform this inspection today. You're required by law to comply." Margaret didn't take the paper. She didn't even look at it. Her hand went to her hip, then lifted, not in surrender, but in signal. Out from the back room and through the kitchen door came four men, white, broad, suspiciously alike in build and energy, like they had all been pulled from the same backyard militia. One wore a sleeveless hunting vest, another had a snake tattoo curling up his neck. Their eyes didn't search for facts, they searched for targets. Margaret folded her arms, her voice lost its sugar entirely. "You want to inspect something? Try the inside of an ambulance, because you're not stepping one foot into my kitchen." Jamal looked at the men, then back at her. "You do realize you're escalating this?" Her smile turned to steel. "I am the escalation." One of the men stepped forward, the smallest one, still a head taller than Jamal. He puffed his chest out, smirked, and said, "Heard you like to write reports. Why don't you write this down? Georgia don't belong to you." Then he shoved Jamal. It wasn't a hard shove, not the kind that makes you fall, but it was deliberate, calculated, a message, a dare. Jamal's shoulder absorbed the contact. He didn't stumble, he simply blinked, once slow. His hand moved to his phone, not to call, to record. And across the room, someone else already had their phone up. A waitress, a customer, a lens catching history at 30 frames per second. What followed wasn't chaos. It was something colder, slower, a standoff with the smell of grease and sweat hanging like a curtain. One of Jamal's colleagues reached for the door. Margaret barked, "Touch that handle and I swear." The sentence never finished because sirens bloomed in the distance. Blue and red flickered against the restaurant windows. The front door opened. Officers stepped inside. "Hands where we can see them." Margaret turned, furious. "This is my property. I didn't do anything wrong." One of the officers raised a brow. "We've seen the footage, ma'am. You assaulted a state official. That's not your kitchen anymore. That's a crime scene." Jamal stood in the middle of it all. The smoke, the lights, the noise. But inside him there was only quiet. Not peace, not yet, but something just as steady. As Margaret's wrists were cuffed and her shouts dissolved into static, Jamal reached for his clipboard and finished what he came here to do. The page turned. The pen touched paper. Inspection initiated. Night doesn't fall in Hartswell. It seeps in. The lights in the motel parking lot flickered like they were thinking twice. A neon vacancy sign blinked red above the office door, humming softly like a bad memory. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. Then silence. Jamal stood by his room window, blinds half open, heart pulsing steady behind his ribs. He hadn't unpacked. He never did on overnight jobs. There was something about keeping the suitcase closed, as if staying mobile meant staying safe. Then he saw it, a shadow outside, not a trick of the light, a figure, then two, then more, and a voice, unmistakable, cracked by rage. "Come out, coward! You think hiding makes you right?" Margaret, he didn't move, didn't blink. Just watched as she stepped into full view under the parking lot light, her red hat still on, her face twisted with something that looked less like hate and more like hunger. Behind her were the same men from the restaurant, their shirts different, but their posture unchanged. Shoulders forward, fists half closed, like violence had a muscle memory. Jamal's breath shortened, not panicked, focused. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911 with practiced speed. "This is Inspector Jamal Carter. I'm being followed, threatened. Motel off Road 11. They're outside now." As he spoke, a bottle shattered against the side of the building. He ducked, not from fear, from reflex. "We see you, boy. Come say that brave stuff now," one of the men shouted, laughing like it was a game. Jamal bolted for the back door. The cold metal handle burned against his palm. He slipped into the alley behind the motel, shoes striking pavement with precision, not panic. The adrenaline made the night feel louder. The slap of footsteps, the thud of boots behind him, Margaret's voice trailing like smoke. "You don't belong here. We'll make sure you never walk into another place like mine again." He turned a corner, a row of dumpsters, a dead end. His pulse kicked up, not terror, just calculation. Then he saw it, a delivery truck, idling near the loading dock of the adjacent diner, back doors open. A driver inside, sipping coffee from a thermos, eyes wide as Jamal approached. "Please," Jamal said, low but urgent. "I need to get inside. They're following me." The man didn't ask questions, just nodded once. Jamal climbed in. The metal interior of the truck was sharp with the scent of onions, bleach, and something faintly citrus. His hands trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from the weight of staying composed too long. Outside, voices passed, laughter, curses, footsteps crunching gravel, then sirens, sharp, certain, like justice wearing a uniform. The truck door opened gently. A flashlight beam swept across the boxes. "Inspector Carter?" a calm voice asked. Jamal exhaled. "Yes." Minutes later, from the side of a police cruiser, he watched through the tinted window as Margaret Hensley was pressed against the hood of a squad car. Her red hat tumbled to the pavement. She shouted something, maybe defiance, maybe denial, but the night didn't care. The night just held it. And Jamal, he sat silent, breathing, watching. Justice is slow, he thought, but it moves. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature, but in tone, all pale wood and polished silence lit by dusty sunlight slanting through tall windows. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, the kind that listens, that waits. Margaret Hensley sat stiff in the defendant's chair, no longer framed by her flags or flanked by her men. Her red hat was gone, her lipstick faded. The corners of her mouth, once so quick to sneer, now trembled with a stiffness that wasn't fear, but something like realization. That this wasn't her room, not anymore. Across from her, Jamal sat still, back straight, hands clasped loosely in his lap. He wore the same uniform, freshly pressed, badge gleaming faintly. But today it felt heavier, not because of the moment, but because of the memory. The judge's voice echoed through the room, deliberate, neutral, but edged with something sharp. Authority wrapped in restraint. Ms. Hensley is charged with obstruction of public duty, verbal and physical assault, and unlawful pursuit. Mr. Carter, would you please confirm for the court the sequence of events? Jamal stood. His voice was calm, clear. He didn't dramatize, didn't editorialize. He simply told the truth, with the kind of quiet clarity that made people listen harder. Then came the evidence. A screen lowered. The lights dimmed. The room filled with the flickering images of Margaret's anger, caught on phones and security cameras. Her face inches from Jamal's, spitting words like venom. Her men shoving, jeering. The parking lot, moonlit and monstrous, echoing with shouts of, "You don't belong here." Then the 911 call, played aloud. "They're following me. I'm an inspector. I need help." The jury didn't move, but their silence swelled with meaning. Margaret's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "My client was under pressure. She misunderstood the situation. Emotions ran high. She believed she was defending her property, her community." He paused for sympathy that never came. "She reacted poorly, yes, but—" "Poorly?" the judge interjected. "One of your client's men shoved a state official. She chased him across a parking lot, shouting racial threats. This is not misunderstanding. This is malice." A silence deeper than before settled into the benches. You could almost hear the floorboards bracing themselves for the verdict. The judge spoke again, voice now carrying the finality of stone. "Margaret Hensley, you are hereby found guilty on all counts." Jamal didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't celebrate. He just exhaled. A long, quiet breath. The kind you don't know you've been holding until it's gone. Not a victory, not relief, just release. The gavel fell. Margaret closed her eyes, and the town of Hartswell, or at least the part of it that had listened, heard something it hadn't in a long time. Consequences. Hensley's BBQ closed on a Tuesday. There was no ceremony, no last plate of ribs, just a notice taped to the window. Establishment seized, license revoked. The wind tugged at the corners of the paper, as if trying to rip it down. But it stayed, like truth does, once nailed in place. Within days, the signs came down. The flags, the slogans, the symbols clinging to the walls like mildew. The red paint was stripped from the bricks. The smoke-stained windows finally opened. And for the first time in 30 years, the building breathed. Margaret's assets were seized, her name erased from the registry of business owners. Trucks came and went, hauling out old fryers, crates of sauces, photos of a past that no longer had a future. But what lingered was not silence. It was voice. A former waitress, young, black, quiet, stepped in front of a local reporter's camera, her hands trembling, but her words solid. "She wouldn't let me serve certain people. Told me I smiled too much at the wrong ones. I stayed because I needed the job. But every day I left feeling smaller." Others followed. A dishwasher, a delivery driver, even a former cook who once quit mid-shift after Margaret called him a stain in the kitchen. And then came the paint. It started as primer, gray, plain, practical. But soon brushes moved across brick like memory across time. A mural began to form. Bold strokes, careful lines, faces, light. And at the center, standing not tall but steady, a young black man in a health inspector's uniform, clipboard in hand, eyes calm, not triumphant, not defiant, just present. The inscription beneath him read, "Not a hero, just someone who did his job." And above the doorway, where once hung a banner of exclusion, now stood a new sign, "Greenwood Cafe open to all, no exceptions." Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and honey-warm bread. Laughter floated through the windows. The light didn't need to fight to get in anymore. It simply poured, golden and unashamed. And though some still drove past with narrowed eyes or tightened jaws, most stopped, curious, hungry, ready for something new. What once stood as a monument to hate was now something else entirely. A space rewritten, a past acknowledged, and a future quietly beginning. The road out of Hartswell was long, straight, and dusted gold by the late afternoon sun. Jamal drove in silence. No music, no talk radio, just the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt and the occasional whisper of wind slipping through the cracked window. The town rolled by in the rearview mirror, slower than he remembered, smaller than it once felt. He passed the old water tower, the gas station with one pump still working, the church steeple that caught the light just right at this hour. And finally, the building that used to be Hensley's. Now it was Greenwood Cafe. There were people sitting on the porch, not just white, not just black, just people, sipping coffee, laughing, existing. Jamal didn't stop, didn't wave. He simply looked once, held the image in his mind, and kept driving. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel angry. He felt something else. Closure. The kind that doesn't come with applause or headlines. The kind that settles in your chest like a stone. Or maybe a seed. He thought about Margaret, not with bitterness, just with clarity. She wasn't the first to question him because of his skin. She wouldn't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, she'd be the last one to get away with it here. He turned onto the highway, the sun dipping low behind him, casting long shadows ahead. Justice wasn't loud, he thought. It never needed to be. There was work waiting in the next town, another restaurant, another inspection, another chance to do what was right, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He reached for the clipboard on the passenger seat, ran a thumb along its edge, straightened it, and drove on. And as Hartswell disappeared behind him, a single line lingered in his mind, quiet, unwavering, like a promise made only to himself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply not to walk away.